What's up, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to discuss Darwin's big idea, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. This is something that we've built up to at this point. We've talked about his voyage on the Beagle, where he sailed all around the world, collecting specimens, taking notes, and he came up with this idea that species vary globally, locally, and over time. We also talked about the people who influenced Darwin's ideas, including geologists such as James Hutton and Charles Lyell. We talked about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. We talked about Thomas Malthus, and we also discussed breeders and artificial selection. So all of this kind of led to this big moment where Darwin finally published his results. And he published it in this book called On the Origin of Species, or sometimes you might just hear it referred to as The Origin of Species without the on. And that was published in 1859. So in this video, I want to talk about his big ideas, the big components of his theory of evolution. So let's talk about those big components. So the first component is natural selection. Now, we talked about how artificial selection happens when humans determine what traits get passed down from generation to generation. So, for instance, we talked about wolves, how wolves were domesticated, and then out of those wolves, let's say you want to create a pug over generations and generations of breeding, you basically selectively breed just the offspring that have the short snouts and the small stature, right? So you take the smallest, shortest snouted pugs, or wolves, you take those wolves, you only breed those, and then you keep on breeding the runts of the litter, if you will, and only allow them to breed, and eventually you'll get yourself a pug over many generations of selective breeding, of artificial selection. So Darwin said if this can happen artificially, why can't it happen naturally? Except instead of humans deciding what traits get passed down, nature is deciding. So let's take, for instance, a giraffe that we already know from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck that giraffes have changed over time. If we look at the fossil record, giraffes' necks have gotten longer and longer. So here we have an ancient ancestor giraffe with a relatively short neck. Now that giraffe breeds. It has a bunch of offspring. So there's going to be some variation in the offspring. You can see this even if you have siblings. If you have siblings, you know that you don't look exactly like your sibling. And that's due to things like mutations, that's due to things such as crossing over during meiosis, random sperm and egg fusion. So all of these things lead to variation in the offspring, right? So now, if we think about Thomas Malthus, he talked about how human populations can only grow at such a fast rate. And he said that there are these limiting factors, such as resources, space, food, for instance. There's also things like diseases that could limit the population of humans. So in nature, there are predators. There's limited food, right? So there's going to be some amount of competition. And there's going to be this idea of survival of the fittest, where only the fittest for that environment survives. Now, this might not necessarily mean the strongest. This just means that you are most adapted to your environment. So, for instance, if we take giraffes that have longer necks can reach higher up food, so they will have a higher likelihood of surviving. So, out of all of the offspring, the one that survives is the one with the longest neck, and the other ones, because they can't reach the higher up leaves, they will more likely than not die off, and they might be easier to take down if we consider predators like lions and stuff like that. So maybe it's harder to take down a giraffe with a giant long neck, and especially those giraffes can reach those higher up leaves. So these giraffes with the longer necks survive, they reproduce, and now they have a bunch of offspring that have different size necks, but they gradually are getting longer on average. And the longest of the necks will keep on surviving and reproducing. So there's this variation. There's variation in natural selection. There's survival of the fittest. So there's certain selective pressure that's put on by the environment. Then after that, the ones that are fittest, they get to survive. And if you survive, you can reproduce. And then there's inheritance. And over time, you're going to see organisms become gradually more and more adapted to their environment. So, for instance, these giraffes could get longer and longer necks. If you are living in the rainforest, and maybe you're a frog, if you look more and more like the plant, it's harder to pick you out, and then over time we get camouflage, right? That would be adaptation over time, or adaptation over time. So a good way to remember natural selection, the key components, is this abbreviation VISTA. So this acronym VISTA. So V is for variation that we see in the offspring. I is for inheritance, so those that survive will pass on their traits to their offspring. And then there's selection, so only the organisms that are best adapted for their environment will survive, they will be selected for, and they will get to reproduce and pass on their genetic material, their traits to the next offspring. And then there's time, so we have to remember that in order for evolution to occur, we need lots and lots of time. So species changing over long, long periods of time, you need millions of years for that to occur. And then finally, adaptation. Organisms will become gradually more adapted to their environment. We're not talking about individuals, like I'm not going to, as an individual, going to become more adapted to my environment, but as a population, over generations and generations, the population will become adapted through natural selection, because the fittest will survive and the ones that are not fit will die. And I also wanted to talk about the second component of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So yes, there's this whole idea of survival of the fittest. Yes, the fittest get to reproduce and pass on their genetics, and those organisms will become gradually more adapted to their environment over time. But if you reverse this process, if you try to think of going back in time, you will see that species, let's say I were to hold on to the hand of my mother, and then my mother were to hold on to the hand of her mother, and that mother was holding on to the hand of her mother. If you can imagine this going back in time, eventually you would stop looking the way humans look, and you would look gradually different, more like the fossil record shows us. And over time, you would see that there's going to be common ancestry. So our closest living relative today are apes, or chimpanzees to be more specific. So chimpanzees and us, over time, if we did that whole analogy of holding your mother's hand and that mother holding her mother's hand and so on, eventually you would see that the mothers look less and less human, and they get more and more, they look more and more hairy, let's say, and gradually you're going to find yourself holding the hand of a mother who's holding the hand of a child who diverged to become apes. So species diverge over time, and if you trace this back, so if you reverse natural selection, you reverse history using the fossil record and using evidence that we will discuss later on, you would see that all organisms, whether it's humans, apes, dogs, lizards, even plants, if you go far back enough in time, you would see that we all share a common ancestor, that all organisms diverged from a single organism that over time split and became different species. So this was a big component of Darwin's theory of evolution. And so in a future video, we will discuss evidence for evolution that Darwin uses, such as the fossil record, such as our relatedness with genetic material, something that Darwin didn't necessarily use, but we now use today, to show common descent, to provide evidence for common descent with evolution. So expect that evidence for evolution video to come soon. But hopefully that was helpful, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to comment them below, send me an email, any of those work. So I will see you in the next video.